In July 2008, rampaging looters ransacked the Mosul Museum in Iraq, stealing and destroying thousands of artifacts, no doubt many of you will remember this. And the resultant outrage was directed not only at the looters themselves, but also at the failure of the United States, United Kingdom armed forces to prevent what archaeologists later described as a global catastrophe for world culture. In another widely criticized incident, the US troops, sorry to blame you guys again, set up camp on the site of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, causing significant damage to the site in an attempt to render it fit for military purposes. And in 2012, a group linked to Al-Qaeda destroyed ancient mausoleums in Timbuktu, and that was the attack which triggered what would eventually become the International Criminal Court's first prosecution of the destruction of cultural heritage as a war crime. Now, of course, by 2017, ISIS was also making international headlines for its destruction of world-renowned cultural heritage sites across Iraq, Syria, and Libya. And groups affiliated with ISIS released videos that were showing these devastating attacks on, for example, the ancient sites of Palmyra and Nimrud, and the widespread destruction of artifacts in, again, the Mosul Museum. There are also reports that terrorist organizations were drawing funds from the organized looting of the archaeological sites. Now, the resultant calls for action ranged from pleas for training for locals who were trying to protect the heritage to demands that military forces be deployed to guard against the important sites and expel ISIS fighters from areas that were rich in this kind of tangible heritage. They also included renewed calls that states that hadn't yet done so ratify the Hague Convention on the protection of cultural property in times of armed conflict. So the Hague Convention obliges states to take protective measures towards their own heritage sites and artifacts, to protect heritage in territory that they occupy, and to limit the use and damaging of heritage sites by their combatants. Now, these obligations contained in the Convention raise difficult questions about how we ought to weigh the value of protecting heritage against risks to persons. So in this respect, the laws of war have significantly outpaced work on the ethics of war. So despite the very rapid expansion of that literature over the last 20 years, most of which was spurred by the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's been very little philosophical exploration of the moral status of heritage in war. And this is particularly worrying because lots of states have already signed the Hague Convention. In fact, they've been signatories for decades. And so they and their combatants are already subject to these legal obligations. So when the UK ratified the convention in 2017, in the wake of ISIS's attacks in the Middle East, this was hailed by campaigners as wonderful news that showed that the UK was finally taking the protection of cultural property in the event of armed conflict seriously. Now, in our book, Derek and I suggest that, in fact, the moral constraints on endangering both civilians and combatants significantly limit what the Hague Convention and any other military heritage protection policies can require of combatants. So part of the tragedy of threats to heritage, we argue, is that often it's morally impermissible to order combatants to protect heritage, given the risks of harm that such protections would impose on persons. Now, of course, ISIS's campaign across the Middle East extended far beyond attacks on heritage. So our newspapers and our screens were filled with images like these, showing not just the demolished temples and the statues and the museums, but also, of course, dead bodies, devastated cities, and thousands of refugees fleeing the conflict. And this juxtaposition between the buildings and the people caused something of a backlash against those who were voicing their concerns about the destruction of ancient ruins. So in the face of so much very kind of acute human suffering, it can seem inappropriate to worry about anything other than the urgent and basic needs of people. And this kind of criticism has been popularly summarized as a dispute about stones versus lives. And this is a dispute that was reignited in 2019 by the fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. So in the weeks after the fire, I'm sure you'll remember that an estimated $1 billion was raised to rebuild the damaged cathedral. And critics argue that the money would be better spent addressing the pressing and unmet human needs that were rooted in the widespread poverty and homelessness that exists across Paris and indeed across the world. Now, by way of response, advocates for heritage protection are keen to stress that protecting cultural heritage, including meeting the obligations that are laid out in the Hague Convention, does not undermine the protection of life. So almost invariably, they defend this claim by invoking what we can call the inseparability thesis. Now, according to this thesis, protecting people is inseparable from protecting heritage, and therefore conflicts between protecting people and protecting heritage are impossible. So, for example, writing in her capacity as Director General of UNESCO, Irina Bokova asserts that in modern conflicts, there is no need to choose between saving lives and preserving cultural heritage. The two are inseparable. Elsewhere, she claims that at UNESCO, we believe that there is no choice to be made between saving lives and saving cultural heritage. In an address to the UN General Assembly, James Cuno, who was then president of the J. Paul Getty Institute, remarked that we have all heard the argument that the protection of human life is more important than the preservation of cultural heritage, and that we shouldn't give attention to the latter until we have secured the former. This is a false dichotomy, a false choice. Cultural heritage is completely intertwined with the survival of a people. Thomas Weiss and Nina Connolly argue that the protection of people and the protection of heritage are conceptually and operationally inseparable. So I think we should be careful not to mistake the inseparability thesis for the much weaker and, of course, much more plausible view that heritage is often good for people and that heritage protection, therefore, is often good for people. So it's true that people often have an interest in heritage and that protecting heritage will protect that interest. Indeed, in mine and Derek's view, the moral significance of heritage lies in its contribution to human flourishing, so basically in its being good for people and helping their lives to go well. But protecting heritage sometimes conflicts with people's other interests, that is, with other things that are good for people, including their interest in staying alive. So taken on its own, the weaker claim that heritage is often good for people just offers us no guidance about how to proceed in the face of these kinds of conflicts. After all, staying alive is also good for people. So this weaker claim is really no response at all to the stones versus lives challenge. So that challenge is not grounded in the claim that heritage is not good for people. It's grounded in the claim that protecting heritage can come at the expense of other interests, including protecting lives. So it's this claim that the inseparability thesis denies. And as these quotes indicate, I think, the inseparability thesis has many prominent and extremely influential defenders. Now, it is, I suspect, largely because of the popularity of this thesis amongst heritage professionals that the risks of heritage protection have evaded scrutiny for so long. Now, despite its influence, the inseparability thesis is profoundly and I think obviously mistaken. The conflicts between protecting heritage and protecting people are, of course, rife, both within war and without. So they're revealed in debates about the distribution of scarce resources, in calls for military intervention to protect cultural heritage from attack, and in the Hague Convention itself. So the Hague Convention holds, for example, that combatants may intentionally damage cultural heritage on the grounds of imperative military necessity, so that is, in pursuit of a military advantage, only when there's no feasible alternative for obtaining a similar military advantage. And it also says they must take all feasible precautions to avoid collaterally damaging cultural property, and that any collateral damage that they cause must not be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. And they must also, to the maximum extent feasible, refrain from placing military objectives near to cultural property. Now, these notions of necessity and feasibility and excessive damage are all moralized notions in the sense that they require weighing things of moral significance against each other and making trade-offs between them. So just as a pretty simple illustration, imagine that two courses of action, offensive A and offensive B, have roughly equal chances of achieving the same military advantage and that there are no other available courses of action that can achieve that advantage. Now, offensive A is very likely to kill 2 civilians, and offensive B is very likely to kill 1 civilian. Now, judging what the convention calls feasibility is straightforward in this case, because the death of 2 civilians is clearly morally worse than the death of 1. So taking the risk of killing the additional civilian by deploying offensive A is unnecessary, given the availability of offensive B. So this is true even if killing 2 civilians isn't excessive compared to the military advantage that you're anticipating achieving. And since A and B are the only means of achieving the advantage, and B is the least harmful of those means, then there is no feasible alternative to B for achieving the advantage. So risking the 1 civilian's life satisfies the feasibility condition. So this is a fairly simple case in which we can see what we ought to do in this case. It's an easy judgment to make. Do you do the thing that will risk killing 2 people or 1? Well, obviously, you would do the thing that risks killing 1. Now, it's much less clear how one ought to incorporate damage to heritage sites into these kinds of feasibility calculations. So imagine that offensive B is not only very likely to kill 1 civilian, but it's also very likely to damage some ancient ruins, whereas offensive A avoids the ruins entirely, but remember is going to likely kill 2 civilians. So is risking the death of the additional civilian necessary? Is offensive A a feasible alternative to offensive B? What if offensive A risks increased harm not to civilians, but rather to your combatants? How much costlier or riskier must the alternatives be in order to render those alternatives infeasible and the damage to the heritage necessary? Now, similar problems arise with respect to the notion of excessive damage, or proportionality as it's more widely known. So how are combatants to judge, for example, whether damage to a heritage site is excessive compared to a military advantage, bearing in mind that in a justified war, military advantages are often intended as a means of saving lives, right? That ultimately that's what you're probably trying to do in your war. So that's what you've got to weigh then against the damage to the heritage. Now, the Hague Convention provides no guidance on any of these questions. Yet to have any significant impact on the protection of heritage in war, the Hague Convention and any other policy of heritage protection must demand at least some increase in risk to the mission and to persons be accepted for the sake of decreasing risks to heritage. It would be pointless if it never demanded any trade-off of the risks and demanded heritage protection only when there was no adverse consequences on anything else. The whole point of the Hague Convention is to get people to decrease the risks to heritage, but that often is going to mean increasing the risks to persons. So then the question is, how might we justify imposing risks on persons for the sake of protecting heritage? So I think it's helpful to start by distinguishing between what we might call instrumental justifications for heritage protection and justifications that are grounded in what we might think of as the value of the heritage in its own right. So we can think of lots of instrumental reasons why we might protect heritage. So, for example, it's often said that damaging heritage will make it harder for belligerents to win wars because that kind of damage will alienate the local population, leading to a lack of cooperation that undermines military objectives. So here, the reasons to protect the heritage are not grounded in the value of the heritage itself, but rather in the predicted bad consequences of failing to protect the heritage and their impact on military success. Or we could think of a case in which, for example, an attack on an important mosque in occupied territory would be a flashpoint for a riot. So when the commander orders his combatants to guard the mosque, the risks to the combatants' safety are justified not by the value of the mosque itself as such, but rather by the good of preventing the riot and the resultant harms to persons. So I'm just going to set instrumental justifications for heritage protection aside, because the Hague Convention is not motivated by these kinds of justifications. It's not intended to help states to win their wars, for example. On the contrary, it places obstacles in the path of military success, prohibiting the damage of cultural heritage, even when this would promote or secure military goals. So the Hague Convention is rather motivated and shaped by the belief that we ought to protect heritage for its own sake, that is, because of its intrinsic value as heritage and that distinctive contribution that heritage makes to people's lives. And so likewise, an account of the ethics of protecting heritage in war should be grounded in the intrinsic value of the heritage, rather than the instrumental capacities of heritage protection. So insofar as alternative approaches are grounded in, for example, claims about winning wars or preventing genocide or thwarting terrorism, they're only really superficially accounts of the ethics of protecting heritage. The real moral work on those accounts is done by the value of the further good that heritage protection is intended to secure. Now, of course, there's a lot to be said about when and why heritage is valuable, and more specifically, when that value is morally significant. Now, I'm not going to say very much about that today. Instead, I'm just going to assume that heritage is morally valuable, and when and insofar as it contributes to people living flourishing lives. So it's a pretty broad view of the value of heritage, and I'm not going to sort of stipulate any further what makes heritage valuable. I'm also going to assume that it's permissible to impose at least some risk on people for the sake of protecting heritage. Because after all, many of our daily activities, such as playing football in the park or driving to the hairdresser or walking the dog, impose non-consensual risks of serious harm on other people. So my football might hit someone in the back of the head or knock them off their bike, perhaps into the path of a passing car. I might crash into somebody while I'm driving. My dog might attack a child. If we're permitted to impose risks of serious harm for the sake of these pretty trivial goods, like going to the hairdresser, then we're surely permitted to impose some such risks to persons for the sake of protecting heritage. So this means that we can't respond to conflicts between risks to persons and protecting heritage by arguing that risky heritage protection is always morally impermissible. That's just a really implausible view. However, I also think that we're only permitted to impose fairly low risks of serious harm on others for the sake of protecting heritage. So, for example, imagine that a fire engine is speeding to Notre Dame Cathedral and it poses a 50% chance of killing a pedestrian, Anna, en route. Now, it's not funny. Now, intuitively, for most of us, such risk imposition seems unjustified. Some of us find it hilarious. We're just different, I guess. Assuming that the fire itself threatens nobody's life. After all, it would plausibly be wrong to knowingly leave Anna where she has a 50% chance of dying in the fire in order to concentrate on preventing damage to the cathedral. So I think we would strongly object to firefighters ignoring human casualties in order to save a building. Now, if so, and if, as most people believe, killing a person is harder to justify than failing to save her, then taking a 50% chance of killing Anna on the way to the cathedral must also be wrong. Now, this is true even though Notre Dame is revered by Catholics the world over, as evidenced by our earlier observation about the flood of money that was offered for its restoration. So really valuable heritage. Intuitively, it seems that you shouldn't even take a 50% chance of killing one person for the sake of saving it. Now, outside of war, heritage protection usually imposes only small risks of serious harm on bystanders. The people like Anna tend not to get caught in the crossfire too much. So firefighters might speed to burning buildings, but they do so only when the risks of hitting pedestrians are small. They do everything that they can to minimize those risks, and so on. Now, within war, the stakes are typically much higher. It's just the nature of wartime military operations that they involve significant risks of very serious harm. So this is just primarily the result of the nature of military weapons. The bulk of a military arsenal is designed and used to cause lethal harm. So this means that collateral harms, of course, are also very often lethal as well. So in many wars, as we know, civilians make up the majority of the casualties. It's also because injuries that would not be serious outside of war, at least in richer countries, can quickly become serious within the conditions of armed conflict. So a lack of infrastructure and resources significantly increases the chances of dying from an infection, for example. A broken bone can easily become a permanent disability. And more generally, war is just unpredictable. It takes place in territory and terrain that are unfamiliar or dangerous or both, and under conditions of extreme pressure and uncertainty. Now, all of this means that military activity in or close to populated areas typically poses a significant risk of civilians suffering serious harm, given the risks of, for example, combatants attracting enemy fire, mistaking civilians for combatants, collaterally damaging civilian homes and infrastructure, and, of course, collaterally killing and injuring civilians themselves. Those displaced by nearby military activity also face the risks that attach to being a refugee, which include, of course, prolonged homelessness, disease, malnutrition, and exploitation. So now take a fairly simple case in which a military unit faces the possibility of damaging cultural heritage. So suppose that it's really militarily important that the unit travel to a particular location in order to destroy a vital supply line, which will be a turning point in the war. They've got two possible routes. Route A takes them across an archaeological site, and Route B through a densely populated town. Now, clearly, the combatants must weigh up the risks of each route And as we've just seen, travelling through the populated area might well impose at least moderate risks of serious harm on the civilians. Now, if they do this in order to avoid the archaeological site, then the combatants are imposing these risks for the sake of protecting heritage. And unlike in our Notre Dame case, where the firefighters risk killing just one person, combatants travelling through a densely populated area expose many people to risks of serious harm. Now, if it's true that it would be wrong to significantly endanger one person's life to save Notre Dame, then this implies that it would be wrong for the combatants to endanger the civilians in order to protect the archaeological site. Now, of course, some people might disagree with our verdict in the Notre Dame case. So they might believe, for example, that one can take a higher chance of killing Anna in order to save the cathedral. But the mere fact that we believe most people would at least find this to be a difficult case in which it's not obvious whether one may risk killing Anna strongly suggests that even if driving the fire engine is in fact permissible when it poses a 0.5 chance of killing one person, the threshold for impermissibility is not far away. The broader and the more important point is that our intuitions about risk imposition outside of war suggest that in most cases it will be wrong for combatants to decrease risks to heritage by increasing risks to civilians, given that the nature of war means that the risks imposed are often risks of very serious harm that imperil many people. So what about combatants? The wrongness of imposing risks on civilians is one moral constraint on protecting heritage in war, and we argue that the wrongness of ordering combatants to incur risks to themselves in order to protect heritage is another constraint on heritage protection. So there are various ways in which protecting heritage can endanger combatants. The Hague Convention requires occupying states to preserve cultural heritage in territory that they control. So this kind of risk-taking is exemplified by a case from 2003 in which US combatants retrieved Jewish archival material from the basement of the Iraqi intelligence headquarters. So the headquarters are already unstable because they've been bombed, and they were located next to a bunch of unexploded artillery. And the bombing had also damaged the building's water system, which had caused the whole of the basement to flood with raw sewage. That's what you can see the soldiers descending into there. So retrieving this material exposed the combatants to a range of threats. One later described becoming as sick as I've ever been in my life after being splashed by the contaminated water during the operation. Now, combatants can also be required to guard cultural buildings and archaeological sites against looting or attack, which obviously exposes them to risk from those who are wanting to attack such sites. They can also be required to incur risks to themselves in order to avoid damaging heritage sites themselves. So the Hague Convention requires that combatants take all feasible precautions in the choice of means and methods of attack with a view to avoiding, and in any event minimizing, incidental damage to cultural property, so they have to try and limit the collateral harms that they cause. Now, some of these precautions increase the risks to combatants, and again, the Convention offers no guidance about when these precautions become infeasible. So take, for example, the targeting of insurgency headquarters in Mali in 2013. So the insurgents had set up their headquarters in a house which was adjacent to a World Heritage Site mosque. And the government forces had initially planned to use an airstrike to target the mosque, to target the insurgents, but they decided that that posed too high a risk of collaterally damaging the mosque. By employing ground artillery instead, they were able to destroy the headquarters without damaging the mosque. Now, this case is lauded in the literature as an exemplar of cultural property protection in action. So UNESCO described this as an instance of best practice. But as the archaeologist Laurie Rush argues, clearly this success placed the artillery crew at much greater risk. In general, Rush notes, combatants may need to assume additional risk in order to remove a target that has been deliberately placed near a cultural site or feature. Now again, I grant that we have duties to protect and to avoid damaging heritage, but I doubt that we can be required to incur any significant risk to ourselves for the sake of heritage. So imagine, for example, that a bystander to the Notre Dame cathedral fire can douse the flames, but only at a high risk of incurring serious burns to her arms. I think it would be wrong to force or coerce her into enacting such a rescue. The reason why it's wrong to force a person to incur such a risk for the sake of protecting even very valuable heritage is that she has no duty to incur it. It would also be wrong, for example, for a police officer to order her to incur such a risk, even if police officers are sometimes permitted to give orders to members of the public. Incurring such a risk is supererogatory, that is, it goes beyond what morality can require. And that means that it's wrong to force or order somebody to incur it. So likewise, imagine that the bystander can avoid being burnt by the fire only by smothering the flames with part of the Bayeux tapestry, which she just, this handy thing she found, look what I got. Phew. Now, perhaps we must suffer somewhat greater harm to avoid damaging heritage than to save it, but I doubt that a person must let herself suffer serious burns rather than damage a tapestry. It would, I think, clearly be wrong to try to prevent someone from shielding herself from the fire with the tapestry, pulling the tapestry out of her hands and exposing her to the flames. This gives us at least prima facie reason to think that it's wrong to order combatants to incur even moderate risks for the sake of protecting heritage. Now, of course, combatants routinely incur risks that ordinary citizens are not obliged to incur. And we usually justify this by saying, well, the combatants have consented to incur these risks. But it's doubtful that combatants have consented to incur ordinarily supererogatory risks for the sake of heritage. Now, this is partly because there's good reason to doubt that many combatants issue valid consent, by which I mean free and informed consent, to any of the risks of combat. So in general, the higher the stakes of an activity, the higher the bar for valid consent. And this bar is sensitive to two components of consent. So the first is the agent's cognitive capacity, and the second is the quality of the information that she has on which to base her decision. Now, it's widely accepted that consenting to a higher stakes activity requires a higher degree of cognitive capacity. So this can justify legal limits on the kinds of activities to which somebody who has a significant cognitive impairment can consent. So, for example, somebody who has advanced dementia might have the capacity to consent to a blood test or to a haircut, but lack the capacity to consent to marriage or to sexual activity. Now, higher stakes activities also set a higher informational standard. So a person who lacks adequate information can't ordinarily give valid consent to a high stakes activity, at least when the activity is not one from which she can expect to derive a benefit. So that latter clause explains why, for example, we're permitted to carry out risky but urgent surgery on a patient who has only limited information about the risks or who lacks full cognitive capacity. So imperfect consent of this sort, or even presumed consent, can be sufficient to justify endangering a person when we do so for her own sake. But this cannot justify the risks that combatants are ordered to incur in combat. We do not endanger combatants for their own sake, but rather as a means of achieving goods for others. Thus, the higher informational standard for valid consent applies, given that serving as a combatant is a high-stakes activity. Now, even a cursory look at the recruitment of combatants gives us reason to doubt that most issue valid consent to any of the risks of combat. So in many countries, including many Western democracies, combatants are manipulated and misled during recruitment drives. So a report commissioned by the Joseph Rowntree Trust in the UK found that the British Army's recruitment literature never mentions the risk of being killed, seriously injured, or chronically traumatized. Indeed, the word risk appeared only once across all of the reviewed literature sent to potential recruits and their parents. And then that risk is immediately trivialized, couched in the clearly false assertion that everyone sent on operations is fully equipped with the skills and knowledge to handle any situation. So no risk, you're fine. The report remarks that these recruitment materials give the impression that army jobs have little connection with warfare. Now, this is despite the UK government's requirement that recruitment aimed at the under-18 should include clear and precise explanation of the duties involved in military service. And of course, there's no reason why this kind of requirement should be limited to the recruitment of under-18s. It's hard to see how these sorts of materials could enable a recruit to give informed consent to the risk of combat. Now, armed forces are also disproportionately made up of those from poorer backgrounds, with overrepresentation of minority and disadvantaged groups who are routinely targeted by recruitment drives. Many people enlist only because they lack other opportunities for employment and education, which challenges again the idea that their consent is freely given. And these concerns, I think, are exacerbated by the educational background of recruits, which bears directly on their ability to understand both their enlistment contracts and, of course, the laws of armed conflict that will apply to them if they enlist. So, for example, in 2013, 39% of all British Army personnel had a reading ability of an 11-year-old or younger. Between 2016 and 2019, 50 recruits had a reading age between 5 and 7. In 2018, over a quarter of recruits to the British Army were children. And these problems, of course, are replicated across other armed forces. Now, these concerns, I think, support quite general skepticism about whether enlistees consent to the risks of combat. But there's also specific reason to doubt that enlistees consent to incur risks for the sake of heritage. So part of consent being informed is that the agent knows what she's consenting to, which includes knowing the purposes for which risks might be imposed upon her. But combatants are rarely told that they might be ordered to incur risks for the sake of heritage. The current members of the armed forces currently receive little or no cultural property protection training. So a series of 2014 studies involving US military personnel found that the vast majority of participants had no experience of cultural heritage training and are less than somewhat aware of such laws and protections. And moreover, any training that is provided tends to present heritage protection solely as what they call a force multiplier that's going to save combatants' lives and increase their chances of military success. So it focuses, for example, on how respecting heritage can improve local relations, thereby decreasing hostility and decreasing the chances of reprisal attacks. There's little evidence that recruits to the armed forces are told prior to enlistment that they might in fact be asked to risk their lives, or indeed civilians' lives, for the sake of protecting heritage sites and artifacts. Now, someone might grant the claim that combatants don't specifically consent to being endangered for the sake of heritage, but they might insist that combatants are a sort of special case who issue what we might think of as an open consent to being endangered for any degree for whatever reason their commanding officer or their political leaders think is appropriate. But this is doubtful, I think, by both the standards of common sense morality and as evidenced by, for example, the controversies over the use of combatants for medical research, the administration to combatants of drugs that haven't been approved for general use, and the ordering of combatants to engage in humanitarian interventions abroad to protect the interests of non-citizens. So all of these things are controversial precisely because we think there are limits on what combatants can be ordered to do and what they can consent to. Now, I suggest that when it comes to risks of at least serious harm, one cannot give open consent. That is, one cannot simply consent to whatever risks to which one might be exposed. So this is why, for example, somebody who participates in a medical trial must be informed of the specific risk involved in order for her consent to count as valid. So she can't just issue a kind of blanket waiver of her rights, consenting to be harmed to any degree for any medical purpose. Similarly, since the risks of combat are serious risks, those enlisting in the armed forces cannot issue a blanket waiver of their rights. An enlistee cannot give open consent to be endangered for the sake of the national interest or in defense of our values. These descriptions are too vague to satisfy any plausibly robust standard of information that could validate consent to supererogatory risks of serious harm. So the fact that existing military recruitment practices are vague about the reasons why combatants might be asked to risk their lives shouldn't mislead us into thinking that states are not morally required to provide such information. On the contrary, states should provide much more information to combatants about the ends that they might be asked to serve and the reasons for which they might be endangered. Now, of course, we can understand why states are reluctant to provide this kind of information. Presumably, greater transparency is likely to discourage rather than encourage enlistment. But the fact that a person would withhold her consent were she given more information can hardly serve as a justification for withholding that information. On the contrary, the withholding or the misrepresentation of relevant information plausibly invalidates consent in a range of cases. So if the combatants have not been informed that they might be ordered to incur risks for the sake of heritage, then they don't consent to incur those risks. And if they haven't consented, then it's impermissible to order them to incur them. So I think it's important not to underestimate the force or the scale of these problems with combatant consent or lack thereof. So mine and Derek's argument suggests that many and perhaps most combatants who are currently enlisted in the armed forces worldwide have not consented to incur supererogatory risks for the sake of heritage and therefore may not be ordered to incur those risks. And this makes implementing the Hague Convention and other military heritage protection policies really morally problematic. So if they're to constrain fighting in any significant way, these laws and these policies will need to require that combatants incur what would normally be supererogatory risks for the sake of protecting heritage. And if our reasoning here is sound, then it's morally impermissible to order many or most combatants to incur such risks. Now, these problems could be rectified by improving the recruitment process for the armed forces, something which is obviously already urgently demanded on multiple fronts, as the Rowntree report reveals in considerable detail. It's also possible that consent could be obtained from specific combatants post-enlistment for specific operations that involve incurring risk for the sake of heritage. So the monuments men, for example, were largely a volunteer force. Many armed forces rely on volunteers for specific duties. So, for example, the UK only uses volunteers for staffing its submarines. Norway only uses volunteers for UN peacekeeping missions. Now, Laurie Rush notes with a sort of an air of regret that cultural property protection in the US Army has been relegated to voluntary additional duty status. But our account suggests that far from being a matter of regret, it is only volunteers who ought to be incurring these kinds of risks. And as we've also suggested, the moral constraints on endangering civilians also poses a significant challenge to implementing heritage protection policies. Although I didn't explore it here, in the book we argue that it's even more unlikely that these challenges can be overcome by appealing to consent. So these problems with the Hague Convention manifest not only in the way in which it demands exposing people to risk, but also in its failure to offer guidance about how to balance those risks. So I think if we're to respond properly to the demands of heritage protection in war, we have to not only recognize the conflicts between protecting heritage and protecting people, but also draw on the broader resources that are available in moral and political philosophy in order to make progress on resolving them. And we should be open to the idea that despite the intuitive appeal of calls to protect heritage, it might often be wrong to heed those calls. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that talk. Absolutely amazing and incredibly interesting. The question I have regards some of the thought experiments you gave, trying to figure out how to cash out some of these no feasible alternative options and the value of heritage sites. So you were comparing them on essentially a one-to-one basis. So, one heritage site versus two heritage sites, this sort of thing. And I mean, it's a thought experiment, so we could assume they have roughly equal value. Great. The question that I have, though, is I wonder if the value of heritage sites for a particular region, say, is more than merely additive. So it's one thing to question, what would happen if we lost this site or that site? And in my mind, it's another thing to question, what if we lost them all? So, and that seems, I'm just kind of flying blind here, but it seems like that would be something that's significantly worse than the mere sum total of the losses. And so I wonder what that might shape, or what that might do in terms of general principles for protecting heritage sites. Maybe protecting one or the other isn't as important, but at least some of them surviving seems to me to be something that's more important than just any particular one of them. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I think that's something that people. So I think that's right, that the kind of you get this sort of cumulative effect of as more sites kind of are threatened, that the impact of their loss would be worse. So one of the problems I think in a lot of the literature on this stuff is that people move. There's a kind of assumption that they move very quickly to talking about the eradication of heritage and the loss that would mean for a community. If you lose all of it, and that tends to be the baseline that a lot of the literature proceeds from. So, of course, it would be a catastrophic loss if you lost all of your tangible heritage, and so that's the value we should kind of have in mind when we're thinking. I mean, it's just not generally, as a sort of contingent matter in war. That's just kind of often not what happens, right? What happens is particular sites are being destroyed. And so one of the things that Derek and I explore in the book is that, what would bear on how we should think about the value of a particular site. And often that partly depends on what else you've got. So if this is the last Catholic church in the country, right, that might be its loss would have more of an impact than, say, the loss of a Catholic church in France, where you can't go around the corner without hitting a Catholic church, right? So you might think there it's so much easier to substitute the value. It's not to say that the church you lose doesn't have value, but the fact that you've got something else that can play a similar role that's reasonably accessible and so on. So it definitely matters, this kind of interaction effect of what else you've got. Now, even granting, though, that, of course, imagine you were going to have a case in which someone was just going to, the town was going to be flattened. So say you've got some ancient land, and it's sort of the sum total of a group's cultural heritage. So we grant that you can impose more risk for the sake of that, if it's more valuable. But still, the same questions arise about how much risk, right? So say you've got a flood coming, and you've got to choose whether you divert it away from the ancient historical town, let's say, is uninhabited, but is, let's say it's magnificent. It's the whole town. It's the only sort of example of this particular group's heritage, and it's really, really pristine and so on. Or, you can divert the floodwaters, a different floodwater away from a populated area, right? And it seems to me like very implausible that you should not save the people. Even if we grant that this was kind of the sum total of all of their cultural heritage. And part of this is, of course, because often groups create more heritage, and also because we lose heritage all the time. So that's something that gets a bit lost in these debates sometimes, is that we constantly survive the loss of tangible heritage, even quite large amounts of tangible heritage. And communities can, just through natural disasters, not also always in war, right, just lose a lot of their heritage. And diasporas, of course, are kind of physically separated from their tangible heritage. And often, it's not as if those communities then fail to sort of think of themselves as a cohesive community anymore, or no longer feel that they can persist as a people. Often diaspora just create new tangible heritage, right? So I think all of these things have to be taken into consideration when we're thinking about the value of heritage sites. Can something be replicated? Can it be substituted? How likely is it that you could rebuild something? And of course, just what are the choices that you're facing, right? But I think I would still come down on the side that even though that you get more weight when you've got the kind of the sum total, still, I don't think saving even that's going to justify imposing significant risks on persons, even if it's their heritage, right? So I think that even in that case, it would be wrong not to save the people.
I have a question about the consent of the soldiers. I guess I'm just worried that maybe the way it was presented, it generalizes too far. Like, war is chaotic and unpredictable, and I bet soldiers don't think of a lot of the things they might encounter. The risks they might have to take on for animals, the environment, non-citizen residents. There's just all sorts of cases that might arise. Do you think the argument you employed here extends to those other cases, or do you think it's quite constrained to heritage in some way?
I think the general problems are pretty pervasive. So, if you just, for example, just don't mention risk at all, right, then that's a sort of almost, you're not even at that point of saying, well, you only told me about the risks for X, Y, and Z. You didn't mention the risks for animals or the environment. So there's already just such a kind of, at the general level, things going so badly wrong that even though I do think there is a particular problem with it, so I think maybe a better way to put it, it's a shame we already wrote the book, is that I feel like in heritage protection, the combatants are actively misled about this, right? So when they're told about heritage protection, it's presented to them as a good, only ever a good. Only ever something that will save their lives. Only ever something that protects their mission, advances their goals. And it seems kind of deceptive, right? Because actually what the law requires is that combatants take on risk to themselves and to their mission rather than damage heritage. And so I think maybe it's something especially pernicious about the heritage case that perhaps, if you've got something like no one's just ever mentioned it, it's not like there are people saying the animals will be really good for your war or the environment's really going to help you, right? So it's not this sort of false representation in a way. The heritage protection is presented as a tool in the arsenal. You should learn about this for instrumental reasons because it will help you to win your war. And I guess it's that kind of mismatch between that and what the law says and that what combatants are legally bound to do that they're not told about and in fact are kind of in some ways concealed might be too strong, but certainly that's not the picture that they're given that makes me think there's something especially pernicious about that.
Thank you so much for this great talk. My question is about kind of the how much we can extend this idea and our responsibilities to cultural heritage. So when there is not a risk to human life. So just imagining that ISIS told forces that we could go in and take everything from the Mosul Museum, put it on a plane, take it out of the country. There would be no risk to human lives, but the costs would be outrageous. What is our responsibility there? So this is kind of getting into the Notre Dame example at the beginning.
I mean, so when you say, so you said at the beginning, there's no risks to persons or no costs to persons, but also that the costs are outrageous. So do you mean the financial costs? Right, financial. So financial resources require trade-offs, right? So if your government spends $50 million getting this stuff out of there, that's $50 million it's not spending on other things, right? And it could spend those things on, say, refugee camps. And so there's always a trade-off, right? So this is one way in which, one of the main claims we defend in the book is that it's important to recognize that heritage isn't morally special, right? It's just one of many goods that governments have to routinely trade off against things. And this is not, it's not a sort of a special objection to heritage protection. It's just something that arises in politics and political philosophy all the time, that we have to make trade-offs about how we balance healthcare, education, defense, all of the goods that we want to have. We realize that if we have finite resources, if we expend those resources promoting one interest that we have, then that's less to promote another interest we have. And so you still get these problems of, is that how the government should spend its resources, given, let's say, even if we just limit it to the conflict, given the other things it could do with its resources to help the people who are affected by that conflict, right? So if you've got lots of people living in refugee camps who've fled their homes, who don't have medicine, don't have access to food, the kids aren't in school, right? Do you want to spend $50 million getting the paintings out, right? And I feel, I don't think that would be the right thing to do with your money.
Thank you. Do you think that there's, I'm not sure how to put this, that different types of heritage have different moral value? Because one example that you keep referencing is the Notre Dame Cathedral, like Catholic churches, and those have historical value, but they also, like, people actually use them today. So would you compare, or do you think that there's different levels of moral value for a Catholic church that people regularly attend compared to like a statue that's just purely there for historical purposes? Yeah,
that's a great question. Yeah, absolutely. So we think some heritage is more valuable than others. So this is also something that's kind of sort of heresy to say. People who work in heritage are often a bit reluctant to make those kinds of judgments. But given that we understand the value of heritage in terms of the contribution it makes to people's lives going well, that's scalar, right? Something can make a smaller or a greater contribution to how people's lives are going. And so something that's really important, say, to a lot of people, would have more moral value in our view than something that, say, that's just, people might kind of like the statue, but it's not, particularly important to them. They might think it's nice, they might think it's sort of interesting, but it might not be something that's kind of central to their lives, or something that kind of really for them gives them a deep sense of meaning or connection, or might not be particularly historically valuable. So in the book, we think about some of the different ways in which heritage can be valuable, which can be sort of historical value, so something that gives us this sense of connection with the past, or sort of epistemic value, so it's a source of knowledge for us, or use value, so that it's something that has a functional role in people's lives, enables them to kind of come together, to get married where their parents were married, and so on, and this sort of sense of continuity, again, that you often get with sort of functional buildings that aren't just there to be admired because they're beautiful, but actually are kind of have a functional role in people's lives. So yeah, we think all of these things matter. And so you will have some bits of heritage that we might think, the risks you could order someone to incur for saving that might be very small. So the Little Mermaid statue in Copenhagen, right? Lovely, but hard to imagine any Danish person's life going significantly worse if somebody knocked the statue into the water. Bit sad, okay, right? But it's hard to imagine that having any kind of really detrimental effect on someone's flourishing, even though they're very fond of it, and so on. But then there's going to be other heritage sites where people feel the loss much more. And something might be like something very iconic that sort of really represents a place to people, or it could be something that's not really iconic or sort of impressive or fancy, but just, the market, the cafes, the sort of the local areas where people mingle and structure their lives around in a much more sort of mundane but also meaningful way. And so that might have really important value, much more than, say, even something as famous as the Little Mermaid statue. So yeah, we think definitely this stuff comes in degrees. That's what a lot of that's the problem in a way, right? Because that means that each time you've got to try and work out for this particular thing, what are the risks that it warrants imposing.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Helen. This was really interesting. So I'm wondering how much of your concern is about the inadequacy of consent and how much of it is about it just being like an unreasonable trade-off to risk your life to save or to risk lives to save heritage. It seems really plausible to me to think, like in your example of diverting the the river away from, I guess, away from people and towards heritage sites. Like it might, even if you had consent of the village to allow it to go towards them, it might still be impermissible if the heritage sites weren't valuable enough. So I'm just wondering to what extent, would your concerns be mostly eliminated if there were if there's more meaningful consent among soldiers, or would there still be kind of residual concerns?
Thanks. So I think this issue crops up both with respect to endangering civilians and with what you can order combatants to do. So I think even when combatants have consented, there are still just limits on what you can order soldiers to do. So it's got to be some sufficiently valuable good. So even if everybody's up for it, right? There's still, it could be wrong for a military leader to order combatants to go and just, imagine it's really risky to go and get the Little Mermaid statue, right? Then if people want to do that off their own bat, that's different, right? But to be ordered to do it, even if they've consented in general to be endangered for the sake of heritage, it would just be like any other kind of futile endeavor in the military, right, where you just, you send your soldiers over the hill knowing they're just going to be slaughtered, and it's just this sort of catastrophic military mistake. Nobody thinks, well, they consented, so that's fine. We think there's nonetheless restrictions on what military leaders can order. And with civilians, so we talk about this quite a lot in the book, about what if, so there are problems with civilian consent because in theory, it's easier to get consent from combatants because you can change your recruitment process. So there's a process everybody has to go through when they enlist, right? Set aside conscripts, right? Think about people who enlist. Whereas civilians, of course, go through no such systematic process. And in lots of places, you're not going to have any opportunity to ask even a fraction of the people what they want. And then we still think that there are just limits on what you can do, even if everybody consents. So even if all of the people who live near the mosque say, just don't pay us any mind, just save the mosque. And that if you do that, then you might kill, 20 people or something like that. I think it would just be wrong for, a military to go ahead and say, well, they said not to worry about them. Right. So so consent can matter, but consent's not always sort of morally transformative in the sense of just making it permissible to do whatever someone has consented to. There has to be some sufficiently valuable good that still justifies harming them as well.
I had a question concerning the point you made about the value of particular heritage sites being explained in terms of and tied to the flourishing that those sites play a role in. And so in particular, I'm thinking about a scenario like, suppose the current conflict between Israel and Hamas, right? Suppose that explodes into, say, a regional conflict, and you have a case in which, say, Jerusalem is a battle zone or something like that, right? And so you have some of these incredibly holy sites for a number of different faiths. What would your view be? Would it be justifiable for combatants to order their troops to sort of put themselves at serious risk or put civilians at risk in order to avoid potential harms coming to some of these incredibly important holy sites which play a role in the flourishing of...
So our view is that you can only impose risks on the assumption that the heritage is valuable. So That's kind of a given in our view. So we think there can be disvaluable heritage. So Nazi memorabilia, for example, doesn't help anyone's life go well. And so we think that's disvaluable. So we're only thinking about what you could do for the sake of heritage that contributes to people's lives going well positively. Right? And so this is sort of the question that we're addressing, right? So you're going to have a conflict in an area that's rich in tangible heritage. Can you order your combatants to take on risks themselves, impose risks on civilians for this stuff that people really care about? And that's the question. And our view is the risks you can impose are pretty low. So it doesn't. Yeah, Notre Dame's important, right? All that money wasn't for nothing. People really care about this stuff, and it's our view. It doesn't deny that people really care about this, but it's not enough that I really care about something to justify imposing risks on other people for it.
Can I follow up on that? If say, whatever, the Al-Aqsa Mosque or something like that is threatened, is the reason to protect it its intrinsic value, or is it that if it falls, it risks much more conflict, much more violence, much more death? It sounds like if it's the second thing, then you could be justified risking quite a few lives to save it. But if it's the first thing, then the justification is just not there.
That's right, yeah. So you can have an instrumental justification. So this is kind of like the case that we give of, if you imagine that it will trigger a riot if the mosque is damaged, and then you can send in your troops to prevent the riot. And the means of preventing the riot is protecting the mosque. But it's not the value of the mosque that's really doing the work. So for that, you could justify endangering your troops, sure, maybe quite a lot of troops, maybe endangering some civilians as well, right? Because what you're trying to prevent is harms to persons. And so what you're weighing there is harms to persons against other harms to persons. That's an easier calculation to make than trying to weigh different types of good, heritage against persons. And so in the case of where it's just a question of the mosque for its own sake, then we think it's much harder to justify imposing risks for that.
So this ends up being kind of a follow-up. What if it turned out that sort of rule utilitarian style, everyone wins if no one attacks the heritage sites, right? We get good empirical evidence that it really decreases tensions and avoids lots of problems. Would that change your mind?
We wouldn't need to change our mind because that's compatible with our view.
Okay.
Right. So if it turns out that you've got this instrumental justification, which is it's not about the stuff itself. It's just protecting the stuff as a means to ending the conflict or decreasing the chances of future conflicts. Then that's a reason, because then what you're avoiding is harms to persons, right? And so all have reasons to do that. And not just harms to persons, other sort of indirect economic harms and things. All of these things impact how people's lives go. All of them are morally important. So that's not a problem for our view. Our view accommodates that. But what we think is kind of a little bit missing in the literature that exists at the moment is that the focus is kind of almost exclusively, weirdly in a way, right? Because the people who work on this are often archaeologists who you think will be really interested in the stuff. But often the justification, so organizations like the Blue Shield, which are designed specifically to protect, sort of aimed at the protection of cultural property in war, the line that they advance is just the force multiplier line. They just say this stuff will help you win your war. So they offer a purely instrumentalist justification. It doesn't seem to occur to them that if somebody points out there might be a better way of winning the war that doesn't require protecting the heritage, then that account gives us no reason at all to protect heritage. So you think that would be the last thing that an organization devoted to the interest of heritage wants to do, right? But all of the literature is kind of pushed on these instrumental justifications as if they think that's the only thing you're allowed to care about, right? So you have to sort of say, well, it's going to prevent terrorism, it's going to prevent genocide. So we wanted to really just focus much more on what can be justified for the sake of the stuff in its own right? This sort of distinctive contribution that heritage can make to people's lives going well. Turns out not so much, right? But that's good to know, right? So that means that the instrumental justifications in a way are kind of going to have to do a lot of moral work, and so we should scrutinize those very carefully. Because I think it's probably not true in a lot of cases that protecting heritage prevents a genocide, right? So that's, it all builds into the bigger picture, I think.
I think it was a response to Robert's question when you mentioned bad cultural heritage made me wonder whether this could sort of run the other direction, and if, I can't think of an example really, but just say Nazi memorabilia, like you said, if we could risk human lives to destroy bad cultural heritage that we think contributes to, anti-flourishing for people.
That's a good question. I mean, probably not. I mean, it is a little bit hard to think of a case, right? Which you can sort of, yeah. I mean, I guess we have something a bit like this when we worry that people sort of ghoulishly gather at sites and so there was all this stuff about Mussolini's grave. I think, or was it Franco's grave? They wanted to move Franco's grave in Spain, and they're kind of worried that it's going to become a tourist destination for the far right. And so we might think, look, there's some reason to avoid stuff like that. But it's going to be pretty weak. It seems unlikely it's going to justify imposing anything than the sort of the normal risks of everyday life, right? I doubt you could impose sort of particularly high risks, even if you thought that, normally, I mean, partly just because there's often going to be other ways that you have of avoiding those kinds of harms, right? So we have other ways, hopefully, of, whatever difference is going to be made by somebody seeing the Hitler statue. We have other ways of counteracting that inspirational sight that we might think just means it's just not necessary to risk people's lives for the sake of it. But, we could imagine a case in which it's the difference maker and some guy goes on to, be a suicide bomber or something. And maybe in that case, if the only thing you can do is get rid of the statue, then maybe in that case. But yeah, in real life cases, I suspect not.
So this actually follows a little bit on what Maggie was saying, this idea of a site that perhaps needed protection. But I was thinking about, you started off with some examples that touched on heritage sites that were being intentionally attacked as part of, of military, so that destroyed intentionally. How do we think in moral terms about the protection of cultural heritage that's being destroyed in that intentional way, where the attackers are clearly seeing the destruction of heritage as being an attack on people, right? And so this kind of touches a little bit in the thing you had from the UNESCO spokesperson early on, talked about the inseparability of stones and of the protection of cultural heritage and a people rather than individual people, right? So you focused a lot on sort of individual lives, but that sense that the destruction of heritage is also the destruction of a people.
Thanks. Well, certainly. We think that's part of the problems of the inseparability thesis is this kind of this sleight of hand, where the stones versus live challenge is about individual persons. It's about their biological survival. It's saying you've got homeless people in Paris, you've got people who don't have any food in Paris, right? It's not about peoples, and yet people who want to resist the idea that there are these conflicts come back and say, no, heritage is essential for the survival of peoples. So they kind of shift what it is the conversation is about in a way that means it's not a response to the challenge. And that's assuming even that it were true that a community couldn't survive without its tangible heritage. The members of the community can survive, right? So, and then I think it's also doubtful that in just historically as well, not just as a sort of conceptual matter, but just as a matter of fact, communities just very often do in fact survive as a people, even if you destroy their tangible heritage. Diaspora are a good example of this, where people are really physically, geographically removed from their heritage, but don't cease to exist as a people. And so I think it's also just not true that communities, I think actually intangible heritage is much more important from that point of view than the stuff. And there are protections against interfering with intangible heritage, so rituals, practices, languages, these kinds of things, storytelling, assembly, these sorts of things that are just grounded in our much more fundamental rights as persons against interference. Then on the question of whether the people attacking heritage see themselves as attacking people, and where we mean a people. They might sometimes, and sometimes they don't. So kind of one of the features of a lot of ISIS's attacks is that they did it more as often a way of communicating with the West. And so one of the problems was that the more that we started to care and shout about this stuff, the more they did it, because they could see it was aimed at us, right, in a very sort of concrete way. And so some groups destroying the tangible heritage is part of trying to eradicate a particular community. Others it's not. But also, I'm not sure, I don't think that really bears on what I guess would be our sort of fundamental question here, is that what can we do in light of that fact, that that's what they're trying to do? What do those people make themselves liable to, given that that's what they're trying to do? And given that I think that insofar as you're not in fact killing people, right, that makes a big difference to what you're liable to, even if what you're doing bears on the community sort of ability to hold together.
How many questions I can ask? Okay, so this is going to be a really horrible thought experiment. So, for example, if we, on the picture that you show us, like you pick two routes, A and B, and on A you kill two, and on B you kill one, and at some point your heritage, you destroy it. What happens if we attribute the heritage as like equal to like a person or like a property of the one person? Like, for example, if you go the first route, you kill two, you go the second route, you kill one, but you actually know that person, or like that person is important to you or to the community, will that change the value of it?
So, sticking in the war context.
Yeah.
So we're imagining a case in which I can go this way and I can kill. I think I'll kill two people.
Yeah.
But
Other
if
way,
I go this way, I'll risk killing someone I really like.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think combatants can be swayed by that.
Yeah.
I think that there can be. Philosophers disagree about how much and in what ways partiality matters. But I think that when we're thinking about, this is something. So I wrote a paper last year about the duties that Western countries that fought in Afghanistan owe to the Afghan translators and interpreters who were trying to flee as Western forces were evacuating. And one of the arguments that's put forward in that debate is often that these are friends of the combatants. And I think that we should be cautious about allowing people to use government public resources to pursue partiality in that sense. And so I think the same would be true in the war context, that the fact that you have, a preference for killing the two rather than your friend is not going to be enough to justify killing two people.
Yeah, but then, okay, so what about the case that the village that is next to the heritage agree that the military can go through, even though they know that they might get killed, like the 50%, like, they're going to die, which is like, we might go to the scenario of like, okay, something horrible happened, the whole village died, but the heritage is like there, no damage. Would that be like the case of like, well, the building is there, but there's nobody else there to know the value of it anymore?
So there's kind of two parts to that question. So one is, would it be permissible to kill the people and not destroy the heritage because the people have sort of consented to that? And then there's a separate question of, is that a kind of, in a way, would one reason why you shouldn't do that? Because it's kind of self-refuting in a way, because the only people who care about the stuff will be dead. And so it's kind of irrational to do, right? But I think the first question actually is sort of enough that, I just don't think that, so this goes back to Harrison's question earlier about sort of the limits of what consent can do. So even if you tell me, look, I'd rather you killed me than my dog, right? And I know that you are genuinely and significantly attached to your dog. People can have really valuable relationships with their pets. They can be a really important component of a good life, right? So in a way, animals are a really good sort of comparison for heritage in terms of the sort of way in which non-human things, sort of our relationship to those things can really be make a substantial contribution to how our lives go. But I still would not kill you rather than kill your dog. And I don't think that consent would make it sort of incumbent upon me to do that. I think it's hard a question when it comes to failing to save, because I think some philosophers think that you can sort of take your interests out of what I'm allowed to consider. And so you can say, look, I don't want you to sort of consider my good. And so we might think there's some scope there for kind of whether you can kind of take your interests out of the pot and then I should just save the dog. But I think those are interesting philosophical questions. In the war case, I think they're not going to matter very much because I don't think combatants are going to be permitted to act on civilian consent in those ways. Plus, you get all of the problems of children can't really consent. How do you really get consent, and so on?
Hey, in the environmental ethics literature, there's a large discussion of intrinsic value, non-anthropocentric value. For example, the catalpa tree right outside this building is the oldest one in the state. Perhaps it has value in and of itself, regardless of how we value it. It seems that all your examples of cultural heritage are of artifacts, and so you might think that just by that fact they don't have intrinsic value, and so you don't have to really worry about those trade-offs. Is that correct? Are you looking at cultural heritage in that way, and might that be a weak point in your argument that somebody can say, hey, items of cultural heritage, they have intrinsic value, even though they are created by humans, they're artifactual?
So there would be some things which have value as heritage and have other forms of value as well. So I think that's fine on our view. So we talk a bit about things like vineyards, for example, orchards, ancient forests can be really important, tangible heritage. And often those are the things where it's really, an ancient forest is amongst the most sort of irreplaceable, right? Because you can't grow another, or it's going to take you a really long time, as opposed to buildings and things which can be rebuilt often with the original materials and methods and so on. So we sort of definitely accept those as being instances of cultural heritage. I think there's then a further question about whether these things make demands on us in terms of risk imposition independently of their value to persons. And now, of course, with stuff that's part of the ecosystem, right, if you're going to have an impact on that, so this obviously one of the concerns in the environmental ethics literature will be this kind of broader effect on the ecosystem. So I think you could certainly make that kind of argument. Again, that's another type of instrumental justification, right, that it's not just heritage, but it would also be catastrophic for, say, the ecosystem if you destroy the forest, and that's bad for persons and also for animals. So I think animals can have interests as well, and so we should think about harms to animals in war. So it's not as if I think only people are valuable. I think other stuff can be valuable too, and it might be that things that are both instances of cultural heritage and then have these other sorts of values, you can impose more risk for the sake of those things, yeah. But we do focus primarily on things where their value is kind of constituted by their being cultural heritage, just to try and, as I say, sort of keep track of that particular value and what that demands of us, independently of other considerations.
Well, thank you for a fabulous talk, and let's give Helen Frowe a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you.